Hello and welcome to the Wiser Tomorrow podcast. Today I'll be speaking with Max Miller from Tasting History with Max Miller. And Tasting History is a show that Max runs on YouTube where he takes recipes from throughout history and from across the globe and he recreates them in his own kitchen. So first and foremost, Tasting History is a cooking show, but as Max and I discussed, this isn't necessarily the focus or the greater purpose of the show. Max essentially takes these dishes and the history behind them and uses it as sort of a medium or a jumping off point to talk about history more broadly. And Max covers a lot of ground. He covers antiquity, the medieval period, and even some of the late 20th century. So for anyone who's interested in history or food, and certainly culinary history, I very much recommend checking out the Tasting History channel. And for anyone who's already familiar with Max and his work, they won't be surprised to hear that Max has been nothing but a pleasure to have had the chance to speak with. I think we had a really nice conversation covering a lot of ground, hear a little bit more about Max, and talk about culinary history and history more broadly. So I hope everyone enjoys, and needless to say, if you do, please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. As everyone says, anyone who's podcasting or has a channel or anything of the sort, these things are enormously helpful. So for anyone who's willing to take the time, thank you very much. But without further ado, please welcome Max Miller. So just to give you a little bit of context that you might find interesting or helpful, I actually came across your channel from a friend of mine who is a huge fan of Tasting History, essentially has her PhD in the channel. And, she came by last night to have a bit of a discussion with me to help me prepare and see if there's anything interesting that I may have missed. And we ended up just going on a bit of a tangent down a deep rabbit hole of everything culinary history, and it sort of very nicely spotlighted how fascinating of a topic this really is, because there's obviously a huge community, yours, and there are many of your contemporaries, but take myself as an example. This wasn't an area I had ever given much thought, admittedly, before your channel, but after you're exposed to it, it is rich with information.
Yeah, no, I mean, every time, for the longest time, I was thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to run out of things to talk about. Putting out a video each week. How long is this going to last? And every time I put something out, while I'm researching it, I find two or three more, topics that I can cover in the future because it's just a never-ending well. And I mean, there's so much food in the world, of course, but then there's also just so much history. You're never going to run out of history. And sometimes the videos are the history of a specific food, but sometimes it's just a story from history that has very little to do with food, but I want to tell, and so I just kind of connect the two in some way. So I don't think I'm going to run out of stuff soon.
So I assume you have a bit of a long laundry list at this point. How do you go about prioritizing it? Is it just sort of, oh, I'm super interested in that, let me go forward with that one?
Yeah, it's exactly that. I don't prioritize. There's nothing that I feel like I have to get out at any specific time. I have literally hundreds of episodes, the ideas of episodes to go. So I'll be doing this for some years. Um, how I decide on what I'm going to do in any given week, it's literally what do I find really captivating this week? Because I spend anywhere from 35 to 50 hours per episode between the research, the writing, the editing, the filming. Um, and so I really have to be invested. Otherwise, it's kind of a slog. And so I just, what do I find captivating at that moment? That's the episode. And so I always kind of have a plan of maybe the next sometimes 12 or 15 weeks. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this and then this and then this. And it never goes down that way because I'll be like, okay, it's time to start researching my video on butter. I'm not interested in it right now. So instead, I'm going to do a video on the Hindenburg. I want to do that. And then in a month, then I'm like, oh, you know what I really want to do is butter. And I'll come back to it. So it's always just kind of a jumble.
So what comes first, would you say, for you? Is it the food or the history? Which takes precedent?
It totally depends on the episode. I find it easier to have the history come first because I find it easier to find a food or a recipe that I can make. It's the interesting historical stories that are a little more difficult to find because not every food has a history, or at least something that is, interesting or written down. In fact, 99% of them don't. People will often say, "Oh, you should do a video on this dish." And I spend 5 minutes looking into it and I'm like, there's nothing. Yes, it's an interesting dish, but there's nothing interesting to talk about. So finding the history is usually more important, unless it is a specific food that I do think, okay, this has to have something behind it simply because it's so omnipresent. Maybe macaroni and cheese, or French toast. I've done those episodes, and I kind of went into those not knowing anything about the history per se, but knowing there has to be something to talk about. And then it really becomes a matter of, okay, now I need to find a historic recipe, because for the most part on the channel, not always, but for the most part, I do go off of historic recipes. And just as most foods don't have an interesting history, most foods don't have historic recipes either, especially outside of Europe, because Europe really had a tradition of writing down recipes that much of the rest of the world did not for the longest time. China, some parts of Japan, India, they wrote down their recipes, but most of the world did not. The Middle East as well. So there's always, it's like, well, can I find something, or do I have to kind of cheat this one? And sometimes I do, and I'm like, this is not a historic recipe, but it's such an interesting food, or whatever, that it's worth covering regardless.
Sure. And how do you go about actually doing that research, whether it's that 5 minute check to see if it's worth going deeper, or once you've settled on a video topic? Because you use a lot of primary sources, right? So that doesn't sound very easy to access.
Yeah, no. So primary sources are my bread and butter. It's what I enjoy, because one of the things that I enjoy is reading exactly what people at a certain point in time were saying about a given topic. Their point of view is obviously going to be vastly different from a modern point of view, and that makes it interesting. Um, so usually the start of the research starts back there with my library of books, and they're all on food history. Some are actual historic cookbooks, but a lot of them are just information on the history of different foods. And so I can, usually go to the glossary, say, hey, is there anything in here, or the index rather, is there anything in here on this food or this topic? And then I can start going through the book and look at the bibliography, and kind of find primary sources that way. Another way is Wikipedia. That's often the very first step, is just go to Wikipedia and say, you know, is there anything, is there a there? You know, and if there's something on Wikipedia, then it's like, okay, I know that maybe it's worth investigating. It's probably not on Wikipedia, but if you go to the bottom of a Wikipedia page, they have a lot of primary sources or secondary sources that you can then go to and look at those, and then look at those bibliographies. So you just have to, Wikipedia is up here. You really got to drill down, and that's what takes the time. When it comes to finding recipes per se, that can be difficult. Simply because I've gone through so many historic cookbooks, I often I know I've seen a recipe for whatever. And then I can kind of look that way. But if I'm starting from scratch and I really don't know if there's a historic recipe out there, then a lot of it's Google searching. A lot of it is actually looking through old newspapers, because newspapers are easy to search en masse. There are databases online where you can search 100,000 newspapers for a given word. And sometimes the search isn't great because if the ink was smudged or they were using a weird font, then it doesn't find it. So then there's some sorting, but at least that'll give you an idea of, oh, maybe, okay, there were mentions of it at this time period in this place. Let me look for a cookbook from that time period in this place, and maybe something's there, and maybe something's not. I run into a lot of dead ends.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And do those dead ends, or prior to the dead ends, you ever leverage any academic publications? How often does that come up?
Yeah, all the time. It's things through Brill and other online libraries all the time, almost for every episode, I'd say.
Is cool, and apologies for my ignorance on this, but is culinary history a major discipline within the academic sphere? Or is that not really a key area of study?
It's actually pretty new. I'm friends with a man named Ken Albala, who is a professor of food history um, here in California, and he often says that he was one of the first to only practice that discipline. Um, and that wasn't that long ago. I think the 80s or so. So it's a relatively new sphere. Obviously, there have been writings on the history of different foods for a long time, but only food history, really focusing on that, is newer. But it's growing, and even if a certain historian, that's not their only topic, they've often written interesting things within that topic.
It's surprised. I mean, I'm not surprised, and I'm surprised just because there's so many niche esoteric fields of study with paleoarchaeochemistry and all of it, endless things, that culinary history seems a little more obvious and valuable than a lot of these other disciplines. I'm surprised that it is such a burgeoning field.
I think part of it is it does get wrapped into other disciplines. Uh, I also think that in general, it's hard because um, especially when it comes to writings, to history, you're really 99% of it is the upper echelon of any given society that was being written about in general, but especially when it comes to food. Nobody's writing about the food of the peasants, through most of history, especially actual recipes. And so it often ends up coming down to more of experimental archaeology, I believe they call it. And there is that can be useful, but I think that it's only more recent that that's been taken seriously as a discipline.
And this gets to one of the questions I was most interested in asking you because probably another part of the explanation is that you don't have a reference. It's not like you make a dish and you go, okay, let me compare and see how that goes against the real thing. It's always an open question about how well did I do it with respect to the original. So how well do you think you do on average, and how much do you trust that evaluation?
Um, it's it makes my job hard and easy because there is nobody to tell me that I
Yeah.
did it wrong, really. Um, so I One thing with my show is that I make everything in a kitchen, in a modern kitchen, using modern appliances. And so, and that's part of the idea of the show. It's so you can make things at home. I am not using, you know, a wood-fired oven from 1750, or doing it out over an open flame. And so there are flavors that come through in those older settings, especially a smoky flavor. Kind of all food for a long time probably had a bit of a smokiness to it. um, so there are those instances where I know I'm off. There are ingredients that don't exist or we didn't know existed, or in the case of pretty much every single ingredient that there is, they don't taste the way that they did 70, 80 years ago, let alone 500 years ago, because everything has been modified. I don't care how organic, how, you know, no matter what, eggs are not the same. Meat is not the same. Wheat is not the same. It's just changed, and it's changed forever, and we can never really go back. Um, and so, I just have to accept that kind of stuff. So really it comes down to, am I following the method as closely as I can to what they're saying? And that's what I try to do. But then often the question is, how well were they writing a recipe? And the answer almost always is not well. Uh, Recipe writing as a real discipline is very, very new, really in the last 100 years. So older recipes just leave so much to open for interpretation, that the one thing that's for sure is that I'm not doing it the way that they did it, because there are just too many variables at hand. So it's more of a question of, can I get it as close as possible, and maybe even if I'm halfway there, I consider it a win.
Yeah, and the issue of changing flavors of ingredients is super interesting because, as you said, surely that's playing a role. But has there been anything you've made that, in addition to the recipe, there's a bunch of accolades about how delicious this dish is, and then you've made it and gone, what the hell is this? And then, because one of the likely reasons for that could just be that it's the flavors of the exact same ingredients, not a matter of substituting things, but they're just so different that it just doesn't work anymore as a dish.
Yeah, I mean that's happened on a few occasions. What actually I think, in a lot of instances too, especially when it comes to really different cuisines like ancient Roman cuisine, our tastes have changed. Our taste buds are the same, but our what we enjoy is different. And so, things that have a lot of garum, or fermented fish sauces, and I'm making it right now, and the whole house smells. Um, all of these just very different combinations of flavors that we aren't particularly used to, so it just tastes not great to us, or just very different in a way that it's like, oh wow, this is very fascinating. I'm never going to do this again though. Certain textures were popular at given times that aren't now. I mean, gosh, you look at even 19th century and early 20th century cooking, everything had gelatin in it. Just everything had gelatin in it, and I hate the texture of gelatin. So, not my favorite. Um, and in some ways, it's not necessarily that the ingredients have changed, but that they've improved. And I hate to say that because it seems a little judgmental, but I'm sorry. Cakes today are better than
Yeah.
cakes 100 years ago. They just are. They're lighter, they're moister, they're just in every way they're better.
Oh,
So
hopefully that's not going to be taken as some controversial claim because, again, as you say, I don't know how that wouldn't be true.
I don't know, but you sometimes get people saying, well, I don't like how sweet things have become today. And that is true, that in the past things tended to be not as sweet. Um, but overall, I think cakes are improved, namely
Yeah.
from a texture perspective, than they used to be.
And even in terms of the sweetness, though, I mean, you've highlighted this in videos, is that they didn't necessarily do that intentionally all of the time. Sometimes sugar was being rationed. Sometimes there wasn't, sugar readily available. So I'm sure
Yeah.
they very well might have preferred a lot of the changes we've made.
Yeah, I mean, sugar was for the longest time was just exorbitantly expensive, and so adding a little bit was a huge thing. But in a world where nobody eats sugar outside of fruit, it doesn't take very much. I don't know if you've ever given up sugar for any significant period of time, but even if you give it up for 2 or 3 weeks, if you then start eating it again, it's just overwhelmingly sweet. So it didn't take much, and that's what I mean by our tastes have simply changed. Especially here in America, we eat a lot of sugar. So even today, Europeans are often like, "Oh my gosh, these, your guys' food is so sweet," but it's just a matter of what you eat on a daily basis.
Also, before I forget, going back to the issue of writing down recipes, when did that really begin? I mean, you said that there's a Western tradition of doing that far more than in the East, but I guess it was still 15th, 16th century that might have started to become a little bit more regular.
Well, so, our very first recipes are from the Middle East, about 4,000 years ago, the Babylonian tablets. And maybe there are more from that period that just got lost or are still buried in the ground of Mesopotamia. Um, and then occasionally we'll see mentions of recipes through ancient Greece and stuff, but they weren't really recipes. They were more of descriptions of what a dish had in it, which you'd think is a recipe, but they are different because often it would be in a poem, you know, or in a piece of literature talking about a certain food. Um, then really recipe writing here in the West kind of started with Apicius in ancient Rome, but it was an outlier. He and Cato the Elder, there are only a few of these. And then in the Middle Ages, it really started to take off. In the 13th century, you start to see a lot of cookbooks pop up in Europe at the same time, within 15 years of each other, several. Part of that is because the wealthy would share their ideas with each other and kind of wanted to one up each other. So, King of France has a cookbook. I'm going to have one as well. And then the other thing is they stole from each other, and I don't mean that in a pejoratively, but that's how cookbooks were and still are often made today. You essentially steal. Today they just change the wording, but in the past, no, I'm just going to take exactly what you wrote and put it in my cookbook. Nobody was making money off of these cookbooks, so it didn't matter. Um, it really took off in the 16th, 17th century, where because then it started to become, instead of a reminder of how to cook the foods that you're doing for a professional chef, then these cookbooks started to become things that you would sell to people so that they could recreate these dishes in their home. Um, in in Asia and China and Japan, they had the occasional cookbook where, but again, for the most part, it was for the people who were already cooking. Just as a reminder of what was in here, the chef would write it down and give it to his cooks to keep cooking. And so, as it, that really didn't spread around the world until like the 19th century in many places. You see the occasional cookbook here and there, occasional recipe, but en masse, it was the 19th century that they really took over the entire world. And so you can go find recipes from a lot of South American countries, or start to get African recipes and start to get Australian recipes. Russia at that time is really the 19th century.
It's fascinating just because you think of a recipe, a written recipe, as so basic, so fundamental, that not something that would emerge in relatively recent times. Do you think the Babylonians, for example, those very first early recipes, was it even a reminder, or do you think there was a totally different purpose? Just what's the motivation to write that down and to use a poem?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of debate over over it. And part of the thing is we have so few that we can't compare it to other things. It's really just this one set of tablets. And so it's some people say that it was dishes that were meant to be made for just special occasions, these certain special occasions, and but whoever was writing it down was writing it for an audience that already knew how to cook, because the descriptions are so sparse that, you know, prepare the water. What does that mean? You know, and there are lots of possibilities. And then it's just kind of a list of ingredients. And so, and that's really what it was for the longest time. It's just kind of reminders. Even if you go as far as Escoffier's amazingly huge cookbook from the around the turn of the 20th century, it has thousands of recipes, but not a one of them could you cook if you didn't already know how to cook. Because they'll say things like, make a béarnaise sauce. Well, that's an entire step. It doesn't describe how to make that sauce. It just says, make a béarnaise sauce, you know, add it to this, and then, so he's assuming, well, these are professional chefs. You already know how to make a béarnaise sauce. I don't need to lay this out. There you go.
Do you think part of it also was just to protect the content essentially, knowing that, like if we're going to put this to paper, this could be stolen by anyone who's literate, so we better leave it sort of coded.
So absolutely, and sometimes I think well, sometimes that was very much on purpose, by design. There were different places and times in history, but one that comes to mind is the Ottoman Empire. For the longest time, it was illegal to write recipes down. If you were, part of the royal, working in the palaces and everything, you could not write them down. And so we have very few recipes from before the 19th century in from the Ottoman Empire. There are a few, but they aren't royal recipes. They aren't, the classic Ottoman cuisine. They're just little bits and pieces here and there. And it was because they didn't want other people making them. And this happened in other parts of Europe, and part honestly, I think everywhere in the world has always had some sort of sumptuary law at some point where the wealthy get to eat this food and nobody else gets to eat it. So whether it was written down in recipes or not, or simply forbidden in some other way, that's just that's just how it went.
Turning to the point about whether what comes first, the food or the history, how does this align as far as you currently understand with your audience? Are these people who are history buffs who are happy to learn about history through food, or are these people who are mostly coming for the food and staying for the history?
Both, which I always find really interesting. I have, I I don't even want to say it's pretty close to an even mix, I feel, um, because I'll get just as many comments saying, "Oh my gosh, why are you going on and on? I just wanted a recipe," you know. Then I got an 8-minute history of butter lesson.
I think I remember that from one of the mean comments reading. I think that came up a
Yeah,
few
yeah, it
times.
happens all the time. But then I get just as many people who, because I can see where people are watching, and they'll just skip the food sometimes and just go straight to the history. And what I like is that basically, if you start the history section, you're going to finish the history section. Almost every single person who watches the history section finishes. I can see it in the analytics, and that's really cool. Um, and I'll often get other comments that say, I came here for a recipe and then ended up learning this lesson, and I totally forgot that this was a cooking video. I got so absorbed with the history, and that's, for me, that's what the show is. It's not a cooking show. It's a history show with cooking. The history is what's important to me, and the food is simply a way to access that history.
So yeah, so you're viewing it more as sort of a medium by which to get people interested and to talk about a lot of these stories. But how much of an importance or inherent value, I suppose, would you put on culinary history? Because food is universal. It's reflective of the resources that were available, the technology that was available, all these different things. So how much of your interest and the audience interest is specifically saying, I love culinary history, not necessarily the broader historical context?
I mean, I think I have a lot of people who really do focus on culinary history as interesting, and I think it's so. I mean, I'm obviously biased, but I think it's so easy to be interested in culinary history because we all eat. It's such it's so immediate. It's such an accessible thing. You know, it's harder to put ourselves in the shoes of a 14th century knight on the battlefield of, Cressy or wherever. It's interesting, and I really love that, but not everybody does. I think it takes a little imagination. But when it comes to food, it's less so because we know what it's like to eat sugar. We know what it's like to have a favorite food. We know what it's like to, have a food that has a history in our family, and so it's special to us. And so many foods have had that importance to different people throughout history. So and I think that that's why it's important too, is because for me, one of the reasons history is interesting and history is important is what it says about us today. Is the fact that things don't change all that much. And so with food, you can see that. You can see how people behaved in the past. It's the same way that we behave today in many, many ways. Sugar, you mentioned sugar. For the longest time, it was for the wealthy. And so think of a food, well, it's kind of the opposite of lobster. So sugar was for the wealthy because that's who could afford it. When sugar started being grown in the New World, it dropped in price. It just started dropping in price throughout the 17th and 18th century, and so it vanishes from all of the really fine cuisine except for desserts because everybody could get it, so it's not special anymore. And lobster was the exact opposite. It used to be everybody ate lobster because it was the poor man's food. You could just go out and set a trap and you got some lobster. Well, now only the wealthy eat lobster. And so it's not that a specific food is good or bad. It is the importance that we place on that food as a culture. That's what is, it has not changed to today. And we don't just do it with food, we do it with clothing, we do it with cars, I mean, there are some really expensive cars that are terrible cars, and yet my Toyota Corolla, not expensive, that thing's gonna last a million miles, But certain things hold a status that have nothing to do with its inherent value. It's just the value that we put on it. So you can learn a lot by learning about how people behaved in the past. You can learn about how we behave today.
Yeah, it's bizarre how that cultural backdrop is almost second to smell in influencing how the dish is going to taste and how you're going to resonate with it. And do you, and sort of in the same vein, I know you've gone sort of on location, I think, to the UK a few times, among other places. How much do you think, did you feel you benefited more by physically being in the origin or the home of the dish? Do you think that context provides you some additional insight?
Yeah, it does. And so it's kind of the same thing, like you just said. Other than the smell, our the importance that we put on it is something that actually affects the flavor. And think of a dish that your mother used to make right before the holidays. Even if that dish is not particularly the best dish, it might be your favorite dish because of the memories that are associated with that food. And for me, one of my favorite things is travel. And so getting to go to a certain place and being in the space where this dish was made or where it's from, it imbues it with a bit of that intangible importance that you would get because your mom made it or whatever. So often what's interesting is I've found when I've tried a certain food here in the United States, it's been fine. It's been, even good or whatever. But then if I go to England or Morocco, Morocco was a huge one for me, um, and try the food there, even if the actual taste is virtually identical, it's so much more important over there because of the ambiance, because of the history of the people around me actually making the dish. Um, I'm getting ready next week to go to Vienna and to Greece, and I'm really, really excited because there are several foods that I either love or do not love that I'm going to be trying in that new environment. And one of them is Sachertorte, which I don't know if you know it, but it comes from the Hotel Sacher in Vienna. And we were talking about old cakes not being great. Well, that's one of them. And it's a chocolate cake, but it's dense and dry as a bone if you make it, the way that it was actually made. And at the hotel, what I hear, or at the cafe there, what I hear is that they use that very old recipe, and so it still has that quality. Um, but you're eating it in this place, and it's the place that really gives it meaning. If you ate that cake anywhere else, you'd be like, "What is this thing? Why did I just pay for it?" But there, it has an importance. And then there are other places in Vienna that have started to make it, but they make it with a little bit more modernized ingredients and method, and so then you're getting something that really tastes good. So I'm really looking forward to that experience. Yeah, no, I think travel is so important. The actual filming on location, it's not easy, and that's why there are some times where I travel and I take some footage and everything, but then I do the cooking and the talking back here at home because lighting, sound. I'm often traveling alone, so I'm having to do all of this with my camera. So yeah, someday I'll have a crew and that'll make it a lot easier. But for now, I don't.
Yeah, and I'm going to indulge on this topic for a moment just because this is super up my alley. But I think you also are very much so an Anglophile. I don't know if maybe that's the best way to
Yes,
put it, but yeah. Did you went to Scotland a year and a half ago, something like that?
a year ago I was there. 1 year ago, right now.
Yeah, I spent a term just during my undergrad. By the way, I also went to ASU. Meant to get to that little bit of housekeeping
You
for the
did.
Arizona State. Yeah, yes. I'm sitting
Nice.
here in Scottsdale, Arizona at this moment, actually.
Oh, that's yeah, my old stomping
Yeah,
grounds.
yeah. So I spent a semester at the University of Edinburgh, and I mean, I know this is a cliche. It's the kid who goes abroad for their semester during undergrad and falls in love with it, but it was just everything you've just outlined is exactly how I felt. And in Scotland, a place where the food, when people think of haggis, that's usually the go-to example of how foul. But the reality is, even haggis, and perhaps it is just that cultural context, it can be really nice.
Yeah, especially with a good whiskey sauce. Absolutely. And you say the cliche of kind of traveling abroad, but that's what for me that's what travel does. Whether it was the first place I traveled or the last place that I just went, it there's so much the inexplicable importance that I can't talk, I can't explain when it comes to travel. It's not just that you're going to a new place. It's the people, it's the language, it's the history, it's the change in weather, the change in scenery. You learn so much without even trying to learn. It's just you just absorb so much. And that feeling for me, I mean, there's nothing more that I love than learning. And so I love travel because it's like forced learning for a set amount of time that is done in an easy way. It's so much easier to learn by immersing yourself in a new place than it is, reading about it or anything else. So I think travel is so important and people should do it as often as they can. Obviously, it's incredibly expensive. I'm very fortunate to get to go, but heck, even if it's just going to a different state and hanging out with people that you wouldn't usually hang out with, I think it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been nice to see, it seems, I mean, this is probably my own bias a little bit just based on my age and how I spent the last couple of years, but Americans are finally getting out there. I think because, I think a few decades ago there was such a small minority of people who even went and got the passport. And obviously accessibility is still a main reason for this, but I think previously people were like, if I want a beach, I'll go over there. If I want a desert, I'll go over there. But now Americans are finally starting to see that value again in everything you just said and saying, you know what, actually, there's more. Just to give you a quick anecdote, I have a friend who he's one of those people. I posted a picture one time of me at a hike somewhere in Europe, and he messaged me and said, if I wanted to go stand on a rock, I could do it outside my house. And it was just like, what? Like, there's so much more implicit to the experience. It's not, you can't just denote it to like the activity. Like, I can hike there, you can hike here. There's so much more, and it's ineffable. It's ineffable. And for the people who haven't had the experience, at least the right kind of experience, so that it connects with them, it just comes across as, I think, very annoying.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's funny. My mom used to teach humanities in high school, actually in Scottsdale, and she would take students to Europe pretty much every summer, and a couple times I got to go, once as a chaperone actually, and there was this one year where I think we were in Brussels and we were going to see some site, some historic, amazing thing as Europe is filled with, and this girl didn't want to get off the bus. She was texting and she didn't want to get off the bus, and my mom was like, it'll take 5 minutes. And she looks up and she says, I just Googled it. There, I saw it. And it was like, oh no, you totally missed the point of this entire trip. Your parents who just paid a ton of money are gonna strangle you. But you can't win them all, I guess.
It's just, yeah, that's why obviously for the people who are fortunate enough to bring their kids or send their kids over to Europe before adulthood is amazing and it's a wonderful opportunity. The problem is, no matter how well you were raised, no matter how intelligent of a kid you are, the reality is, I think most of the time before, roughly 18, you're just not in the headspace to appreciate it the right way. You'll have a nice meal, you'll see some things that struck you well, but you're not there yet.
Yeah. No, I was when I was a kid, I was part of a choir that traveled a lot, and I got to go to the Philippines and Japan and China and Ireland, and I, incredibly memorable experiences, and I learned a ton. Um, but I need to go back because I would appreciate it on just a totally different level now than I would have in the past. And that's the same thing, even a little bit older. And since we are always changing as a person, hopefully, you what you take from a place is always changing. I went to in college. I went to Italy and visited Pompeii and many other sites, and I thought they were very interesting. I've always loved history, enjoyed it. But today, now that I have an interest in food history and Roman culture, I would enjoy it on a totally different level that even as an adult, I just couldn't enjoy at a different part in my life. And I'm sure if I go back when I'm 60, I'll enjoy it on a totally different level. So visiting the same place multiple times throughout your life, I don't think that's a bad thing.
No, definitely not. And you're making me want to buy a plane ticket. So this is becoming stressful. Have you do you have a favorite destination? Is there something that's really stood out as just wow?
Um, there are two. The island of Kauai, uh, in Hawaii. I love Hawaii. I love Hawaiian culture. I love Hawaiian food. I love Hawaiian music. Everything about Hawaii. Um, so I enjoy going back there over and over again. And the other is just England in general. Um, I I've always been interested in it, and I find without the language barrier that when I go, it's like I'm just it takes no time at all to just be there and enjoying it on a level of I can think so much about what happened in this location, 500 years ago, and there's just something about it for me uh, that resonates. And I feel like a lot of people have that spot where they can just travel over and over and over again and enjoy it over and over again.
Yeah, it's like I said, the only thing going through my mind at this point is just go to the airport, buy a ticket, go somewhere. You'll be fine. You'll figure it out. Another thing I wanted to flag in a bit of a different vein is, and this is true in the podcast and certainly in all of your videos, is there's a clear effort and emphasis and competency in pronouncing everything from Chinese to Italian to Latin to so on. So obviously, there's an obvious component of why you're doing that. I mean, it's just accurate, and obviously focusing on history, historical accuracy, and accuracy in any sense is great. But do you think that there's a more deeper importance to doing that? Why do you take the time to make sure you get that right?
Part of it is, so I went to school for music, for singing, classical voice, and we had to take classes on not just French and German and Italian because we would probably be singing in those languages, but literally just on how to pronounce them as close to being a native as possible. And part of the reasoning was not just being correct, which is important, but also a certain respect for, in that case, the music and the libretto. But there's also a respect for the culture that it comes from, the people who are speaking it. And I'm not always correct. I don't think you can always be correct on. There are just too many words. But when I know that I don't know how to pronounce something, I will seek out a native speaker if possible, just to get it as close as I possibly can. I'll record them, and as I'm filming or whatever, I'll listen to it right before I say it. And it's for me, it's just a sign of respect, to get it as close as possible. And the reaction that I get from people who are from those countries is just always positive and appreciative, because so many people don't take the time to say it right. And sometimes, especially with Chinese or Mandarin, the word can be completely different if you don't say it exactly the same way. And sometimes it will be a curse word or something just totally silly. So I think just making that effort is important. And it's something that I, not that I think that, English is, so many people speak English that it's kind of, we're one of those languages. We're very fortunate that it's like, well, everybody knows English, and, not everybody does, but a lot of people do, especially when they travel to the United States. I'm going to Greece. I don't know Greek. I know a few Greek phrases, but that's it. Whereas most people who come to the U.S., they know English. And so when I meet someone whose English is particularly good, they've clearly spent time working on their accent. It means it's like, wow, you really took the time, and I find that impressive. To be able to, I went to school with someone who was from Germany. You would not know when he spoke English that he wasn't from Phoenix, except for the word that he said, the way that he said puma instead of puma. He pronounced it puma for some reason, and he could never get that fixed. But other than that, he sounded exactly, and I don't know. I think it's important. It is for me. So there you go.
Yeah. No, I definitely think it's as you said, the response has been very clear about that. I've seen in the comments. And actually, speaking of Chinese, I have another friend who's quite a big fan of your channel, and he was the one who suggested to bring this up with you because he has pretty decent Chinese. He's born and raised in the U.S., but speaks a bit of Chinese at home, and he always commented on, wow, like he's getting the Mandarin right. Like that's because it's one thing to get the Italian right and the Spanish, and it's a different thing to get the Mandarin right.
Yeah, there are a few languages that I've really struggled with. Mandarin is one of them. Thai. Thai is one that I really has had trouble with. Nahuatl is another one, especially
Still got
because
it though.
yeah, modern the modern version of Nahuatl is very different and would have been pronounced very differently than the historic one. And then Icelandic. Oh my gosh, Icelandic is just Swedish to any of those languages. They just don't sit in my mouth.
Sure. And Icelandic, I think, is pretty much, 13th century Danish. I mean, it's preserved Danish in a way. So it's like
Yeah,
that
yeah.
is,
I mean, it's a really cool language because of that. It's kind of
oh
like
yeah, oh
Frisian.
yeah.
Frisian in, I want to say, is it Denmark, where part of Frisia is? Um, that language, I guess, is remarkably close to what they think, you know, early Anglo-Saxon before even became Old English would have sounded like and stuff. So it's very cool.
Maybe a speaking history channel is in order, perhaps?
Yes, though there's a channel called I don't know how it's pronounced, Native Long, um, and he basically does that. He only does a few videos each year, but he'll be like, "This is what we think ancient Egyptians sounded like," and go through why we think it sounded like this and stuff. It's fascinating. His videos are really excellent if you get a chance to check them out.
Yeah, absolutely. No, linguistics and anything adjacent is fast. It's the same. It's very similar to food, I think, just because it's so universal. Well, in a different way than food is, but universal, and it's very revealing. I mean, every once in a while, I just go to this etymology rabbit hole. I learned the word gun comes from Gunhildr, and like there's so many. Especially Norse is, in English is obviously a particularly interesting one, but linguistics is incredible.
Well, one word that I just started to learn a little history of recently is the word hello. And I was shocked to know that the word is really not that old. 18th century, I think, is when it started popping up. But even then, it was only used um, as an exclamation, like "Hello there," or "Hello, what's this?" Um, and it didn't become a greeting until the advent of the telephone. And it was the necessity of, because before that, you would say, good day, Roger, or good evening, Charlotte, because you knew the time of day and you knew their name. But with the telephone, you don't know who is on the other line when you pick it up, and you don't know what time it is where they are. So you had to say something else. And Alexander Graham Bell wanted that to be ahoy, 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 I think, which would have been a lot more fun, I think. But what won out was hello. And then now we say that to, not just on the phone. This is just really interesting how language evolves almost always through some sort of necessity. And we just lose that reasoning, why is that? Yeah, I love language. It's fascinating.
I think this is doing a great job at highlighting exactly why people I think resonate with your content so much. Is that, as you said, it's one thing to hear this abstraction to this spotty recount of a very complex event that could have take place over decades, versus words and food and these little factoids that actually feel so much more just in your hands, more relevant.
I say hello. That's interesting. Next time I say hello, I'll think of that. It's yeah, no, it's immediate. It's immediate.
Also, I guess in the context of the phone too, I mean, I can only imagine how those very early phones, the connection, so having some sort of more exclamatory way of being, hi, was probably to the
Ahoy,
benefit of
ahoy.
everyone. Yeah.
Well, especially, as time went on and they had like party lines and everything, my nana would always talk about certain people in the neighborhood would be on the phone all night and I couldn't get on and everything. And it's like, what? If my neighbor's on the phone, I can't be on the phone at the same time. That's crazy. Um, or the first phone book didn't have phone numbers in it because there were no phone numbers. It was just a list of local people who had phones. And so you could just, because there was an operator, you'd pick up and an operator and say, oh, connect me with this person. And they had to have rules of etiquette, like saying hello. This is how you pick up a phone. It's just so, we use it all the time now, but it was only 100 years ago, 140 years ago, that this thing was brand new, and not in most houses until like 100 and not even 80 years ago, which is crazy.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I mean, even having landlines as a kid feels, like a different lifetime, let alone something like what you're describing.
Yeah, no, so antiquated. We don't have a landline. Yeah, that's the thing. We've gone back. Nobody has phones anymore except for my camera. I have a camera and a computer that sometimes can act as a phone.
Let me get to one thing before I forget, because this is the real meat and potatoes. Is what when you I don't know if it's changed from when you set out to where you how you think about it today, but what is the number one thing or a few things that you hope that the audience gains from watching your content? Because it's a fusion of both entertainment and education. But if there's that one thing that you hope the average audience member walks away with, and obviously some historical knowledge, there are the obvious things, but if there's some sort of deeper truth or realization, are you trying to touch on anything in particular?
No. Uh, quite
No, that's a
honestly.
totally acceptable answer.
No, what I want the audience to take away, my goal is every episode for a viewer to gain one little anecdote or fact that they can use the next time they're at a party, or you know something comes up and it's like, oh, you know what? I actually learned this, and blah 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 blah. Because I love doing that. I'm sure many of my friends get annoyed when I do that, but I love doing that. A natural born teacher, I guess. I come from a family of teachers. Whether you like it or not, I'm going to teach you something. And so that's what I hope people get out of it. Any deeper meaning, if you get it out, fantastic. But that's not my goal.
Sure. And that doesn't surprise me, I suppose, just because of how you got started. Because your entire career on this front has been relatively recent and very organic, right? I mean, it was sort of being at home during COVID, as far as I understand, and it's evolved into the empire that it now is.
Yeah, no,
It's,
I mean, so honestly, it started because I like telling my friends little facts from history. And so it's no surprise that that's really what the show is trying to get people to do. I would bring in baked goods. I got a passion for baking, and I would bring in baked goods to my old work. And while people would come up to my desk to grab their macaron or whatever, I would tell them a few facts about the history, where it's from, and oh, did you know this is so the recipe I'm using now is actually what they would have tasted like around the year 1800. Um, and one of the people at work said, "Hey, put this online. This is interesting. Put it up online." And so that's what the channel is, and that's still all the channel is. It's obviously gotten more complex, the history that I'm talking about. You look at some of those first episodes and it's really just a string of facts. Um, and now I try to do a little bit more storytelling and cover broader topics, but it's really the same thing. It's just me telling people what I found out. And that's the thing, is a lot of people think that I know everything about food history, and I don't. I typically know, if I'm what I'm saying in an episode, 90% of that I learned last week. I'm only one step ahead of my audience in general. um, and I think that that's actually part of where the excitement for me comes, and hopefully that comes across on camera, is I'm excited to share this brand new piece of information. I'm kind of like, I don't know if you've ever known like a toddler or a little kid, a 4 or 5 year old who's just starting to learn things. They are so excited to tell you that red and blue make purple. That's all that it is. That's what my show is. I'm like, look at this that I just learned. Maybe you already knew. I didn't know. That's what the show is.
Yeah. And that's what makes YouTube and similar platforms so beautiful. Is it's not I don't want necessarily, the premier, the culinary historian who's been doing this for 50 years and is just going to, sort of plainly explain and regurgitate. The fun is knowing that and then getting to, because like you said, you're in your kitchen and you're doing the research yourself. You're doing it just before. It's just so much more. And again, I would apply this to most content creators. It's that interesting, sensitive balance of expertise and professionalism. Like obviously the lighting is important, the production is all of the production considerations are important. But I think beyond a certain point, you get into the realm of overproduction, and when you start bringing in other experts, it's best when it's the content creator that people develop that affection for and appreciation for, and it's clear where their headspace is at.
Yeah, I agree. Though the way that I've learned all of that stuff to talk about is from those academic, I watch those, I read those. So then it's me just regurgitating. That's why I always kind of liken myself to a news anchor. A news anchor doesn't actually typically do the journalism. They don't do any of the searching out a scoop or whatever. They just report the facts or opinions to the audience, and that's what I'm doing. I source from all these different sources, and then I write a script and I regurgitate it out, which I think is, a news anchor is just as important, um, but it is a very different thing. So when people liken me to a true scholar, I'm like, no, 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 no. this is a different thing.
Sure, but I would say you're not giving yourself quite enough credit because the magic, I would argue, is in your own filter. Because, if you and I were to set out on that same topic, it's gonna look totally different. And what you do is wonderful.
Yeah, no, and that's why I say it's important. I mean, you think of back to the news anchor, somebody like Walter Cronkite. I mean, people trusted him and what he was saying, and his delivery was iconic. He wasn't out in the field gathering that information typically, but coming out of his mouth, it was important. And coming out of his mouth, people took it seriously. So that's why, sometimes I try to take some of these topics that aren't that well known or talked about and make it come out of my mouth because I have a passion for storytelling, and I have a point of view on certain things, which honestly makes me a terrible historian, because you're not supposed to put your point of view on things, but I do, and that's why I don't hold myself to the same standard as an academic historian. One of my goals is kind of like, hey, and if you want to know more about this, this is where you look, but it's usually a little bit drier, and that's okay.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me put my fan hat on and speak for probably everybody and say that we love what you do. We love that filter. We love the perspective. So it's been a treat to be exposed to your content. It's been an even bigger treat to get this chance to speak with you. But I will leave you with one. I have one final question, if that's all right, which is for those people who are looking to recreate your recipes. Out of everything you've made thus far, what would you suggest that they make?
Oh boy, I mean, it kind of depends on what you like. If you like something uh, sweet, the pumpkin cheesecake from Bartolomeo Scappi is definitely one of my favorites. And so familiar because it's pumpkin, but also so different because of the quantity of certain spices and stuff that he uses, and the texture is very different. And if you like something savory, I would go with the garlic harvester sauce for beef from Transylvania. I think it's 16th century Transylvania. It's garlicky, but not overwhelmingly. It's fascinating and delicious dish.
So after this, just a bit of an action plan. I'm going to buy a plane ticket and I'm going to go get food.
Do it.
That's my plan following this podcast after this.
Do it. I'm on board with that.
Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it, and I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for having me.